In a moment that left aides frozen and insiders shaken, Prince William, usually composed and guarded, was seen wiping away tears after reading a private message from his eldest son. What could possibly break the heir's iron resolve in broad daylight? The royal silence is deafening, but behind closed doors, a powerful shift is in motion. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Those closest to the inner corridors of the palace describe it as a rupture in routine so sharp it felt almost unreal. Prince William emerged from a closed-door meeting, not with his familiar steady stride, but with a hesitation that immediately unsettled those who knew him best. His eyes were red. His jaw was clenched, as if he were holding something back, something far heavier than the usual burdens of duty. For a man trained from birth to master emotion, the sight alone was enough to spark a quiet ripple of shock. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Something had happened. Something unprecedented. Within minutes, speculation began to coil through the staff like smoke. Aides exchanged glances they normally avoided. One whispered that William had been seen earlier holding a slim, unmarked envelope, delivered not through the usual channels but placed directly into his hands. No insignia, no briefing note, just a private message that never passed through the palace system. Witnesses would later say he read it once, then again, slower the second time, before retreating behind closed doors. And when he finally returned, the future king did not look like a man who had merely received troubling news. He looked like a father who had just had his world quietly undone. Orders followed almost immediately. William's schedule was cleared without explanation. Engagements postponed, calls delayed, meetings cancelled. The machine of monarchy, so rarely disrupted, suddenly stalled around him. Staff were instructed to give him space, an instruction so unusual it only deepened the sense that something seismic had occurred. One longtime aide would later confess that in all their years of service, they had never heard such a directive attached to his name. Not after crises, not after losses, not even after moments meant to wound. This was different. Those who crossed his path in those hours speak of a dramatic shift, not only in his expression but in his very presence. His voice, normally calm and measured, was reportedly barely above a whisper. His hands trembled when he reached for water. At one point he turned away from a conversation mid-sentence, unable or unwilling to continue. And beneath it all was the same stunned observation, repeated quietly from one corner of the palace to another: "He never cries, not like this." The words carried more than surprise. They carried fear. Because if Prince William had been brought to tears, then whatever he had read was not simply personal. It was destabilizing. What makes the moment even more haunting is not what was seen, but what was not. There was no official statement, no controlled narrative, no protective briefing offered to soften the edges. Only silence. A silence so thick it suggested the palace itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way this emotional fault line would split. Insiders sensed that something deeply private had pierced the walls of formality, something that could not be brushed aside, something that could not be managed away. And as the hours passed, one unsettling thought began to echo louder than the rest. Whatever Prince George had written, it had reached a place in his father no crown, no title, no tradition had ever touched before. But to understand the weight of the message, we must journey back to the unspoken war between duty and fatherhood, where one young prince dared to voice what no one else could. The future king is not just a monarch in training, he's a child with his own heart, dreams and fears. But when tradition demands silence and protocol smothers truth, what happens when the youngest voice in the room refuses to be ignored? From the moment he drew breath beneath the gilded ceilings of the royal estate, Prince George's life was not his own. Cameras followed his every milestone, tabloids predicted his destiny before he could form words, and the weight of the crown hovered over his cradle like a ghost. While the world cooed at photos and headlines celebrated his first wave, inside the palace, preparations had already begun. Lessons in posture, protocol, and presence. No detail was too small, no moment left to chance. He was being molded not to live, but to reign. And yet, beneath the layers of royal tradition, there lived a boy who was slowly realizing that his fate was not merely unique, it was inescapable. What the world didn't see were the private glances exchanged between William and Catherine as George began asking the kind of questions most children never have to face. Why do I have to wear this when others don't? Why do they all look at me that way? Little inquiries at first, but over time, they deepened. According to one palace insider, there were moments fleeting but telling where George would fall into a heavy silence after public appearances. Moments when he would slip away during rehearsals for royal events and hide behind curtains or staircases, not out of mischief, but exhaustion. He was not acting out. He was retreating from the weight, from the pressure, from a life already mapped out in stone. It was Catherine who first began to voice concern. In hushed conversations behind palace walls, she reportedly confided in close aides that George was carrying more than he should at his age. She saw the signs, his reluctance to speak during public rehearsals, his aversion to formal clothes, the way he clung to her just a bit longer after official engagements. She worried he was internalizing more than he let on, that he was learning how to perform before learning how to simply be. William, caught between duty and fatherhood, found himself increasingly torn. His own childhood had been a minefield of expectation and public scrutiny. He had sworn to protect his children from that same fate. But how does a future king shield his heir from the crown? Sources close to the family describe tense discussions behind closed doors. William, ever the strategist, wanted to find balance. Catherine, the mother, wanted to pull George away entirely. But amid their quiet conflict, George began making his own subtle statements, opting out of photo ops, turning away from posed shots, whispering to staff that he didn't want to be seen. One aide confessed that George once quietly refused to attend a ceremony unless he could just be with Mum. These weren't tantrums. These were tremors of a soul resisting the machine before it crushed him. And then, on a night when the palace least expected it, George broke his silence with a message no one saw coming. In a haunting letter written in his own hand, Prince George exposed a hidden truth, a truth too heavy for a child, too raw for a future monarch, and too painful for a father to read without breaking. The letter didn't arrive through official channels. There was no royal crest, no messenger, no protocol. Tea was left quietly on Prince William's private desk, nestled beneath a book only George knew his father read before bed. A small folded page, written with unmistakably youthful handwriting but laced with words far beyond a boy's years. And when William found it, alone in the dim silence of his study, the moment that followed would leave behind more than silence, it would leave behind shattering clarity. The first line hit him like a punch to the chest. I don't want this life. I want to be free. A declaration not just of pain but of rebellion, a whispered truth that no crown could dismiss. What drove a child still not yet a teenager to pen such words? Sources reveal it was the evening following a grand palace event, one that had drawn dignitaries from across Europe and placed George once again in the spotlight he had learned to dread. That night, behind the flashing cameras and polished speeches, something snapped. He reportedly told his nanny afterwards that he felt like he wasn't even there, that people talked about him, not to him, and that he felt watched but not seen. These weren't passing frustrations, they were quiet cries from a child drowning beneath the expectations of a 1,000-year-old institution. Inside that letter, George detailed moments his family had overlooked. How he felt most alive when playing with Charlotte and Louis far from the cameras. How he feared disappointing the very people who cheered for him. How he didn't understand why strangers seemed to know his future better than he did. He wrote not to attack, but to be heard. And in doing so, he may have shaken the foundation of the monarchy more than any scandal in recent memory. William read the letter behind locked doors. Alone, no aides, no distractions. He was found hours later by a close advisor, not working, not reading, just sitting. Still. Pale. His eyes red. The silence in that room, witnesses say, was louder than any outburst. Because what poured from those pages wasn't just pain. It was a mirror held up to a man who had once sworn to protect his children from the very prison he now realized was slowly closing in on his firstborn. His tears weren't just grief, they were guilt. Guilt that the path he had walked was now laid out beneath his son's feet, and that despite all his promises, he hadn't seen the signs until they screamed from the page. But this wasn't just a child's cry for help, it was a strike at the very heart of royal legacy, and it would not go unanswered. Behind every strong man is a stronger woman, but even Queen-in-waiting Catherine was unprepared for the emotional reckoning that followed her son's confession. What began as a whisper in the nursery had become a siren in the palace corridors. When William placed George's letter in Catherine's hands, there was no speech, no explanation, only the silent weight of a father who had just witnessed his child collapse under centuries of pressure. Catherine read the words once, then clutched. He page, as though holding it tighter might undo what had already been written. According to insiders, she didn't cry at first. She simply stood there, frozen, as if the walls around her had shifted and nothing was as it had seemed just hours before. But later, behind the locked door of her private sitting room, the dam broke. The woman the world had watched smile through state banquets, comfort strangers in hospitals, and glide through 1,000 engagements finally fell apart. Alone, unseen, and utterly devastated. That moment unlocked every fear Catherine had buried since the day George was born. She had always known that the crown came with chains, but she believed, or at least hoped, that love and parenting might soften the steel. Now, reading her son's own words of sorrow and resistance, the illusion shattered. She remembered the way George had once asked if he could be a firefighter instead of a king, the way he recoiled when cameras flashed too close, the times he clung to her hand when told to stand alone. Catherine had ignored these signs not because she didn't care, but because palace life had taught her to numb herself. Now, all of it returned like a tidal wave. Her discussions with William in the days that followed were described by a palace source as tense, raw, and full of painful truths. Catherine reportedly questioned whether they had failed George by remaining silent too long. She urged William to consider pulling George out of several upcoming public appearances. She even suggested a retreat from royal duties for the family, if only to breathe. But William, bound by his dual roles as father and future monarch, hesitated. He wasn't resisting Catherine. He was wrestling with a system that didn't bend, only broke. As the couple grappled behind closed doors, the palace machine continued to turn, but not without friction. Catherine's growing distance from public duties did not go unnoticed. She abruptly cancelled several appearances, citing personal family matters, a phrase never used lightly in royal communications. Behind the scenes, a chilling disconnect emerged between Catherine and senior advisors. Her instincts were dismissed, her concerns labelled as emotional overreactions. Some reportedly hinted that she was too involved, too protective. One senior courtier even remarked that she needed to remember who the heir was, a comment that, according to sources, led to a screaming match between Catherine and an advisor who had served under multiple monarchs. But Catherine had made her choice. In that moment, she wasn't the future queen consort. She was simply a mother watching her son slip further into a life he no longer wanted. Her decision to step back wasn't a rebellion, it was a shield, a line drawn in the sand. And as she quietly retreated from the public eye, refusing to smile for the cameras while her child suffered in silence, the wheels behind the throne kept turning. But while Catherine retreated to protect her son, forces inside the palace began to spin, and not all with good intentions. When a future king weeps and a young prince rejects the crown, the palace machinery kicks into overdrive. But as whispers became headlines and loyalty turned into leverage, the question wasn't just who could be trusted, but who had already betrayed them. The palace responded with terrifying efficiency. Within hours of William's emotional collapse, an internal lockdown was initiated quietly but forcefully. Staff were told not to speak to outsiders. Mobile devices were monitored, movements restricted. The atmosphere inside Kensington Palace, once structured but calm, now throbbed with tension. It wasn't just about protecting a family's privacy, it was about shielding the crown itself from a crack that, if made public, could ripple into a full-blown crisis. George's letter had not only shattered a father's heart, it had threatened to expose a monarchy still clinging to its image of unshakable tradition. And the palace, trained to survive scandal, began its silent war. Rumours had already started to seep through the cracks. Someone, somewhere, had spoken. An anonymous tip sent to a tabloid hinted at a deeply personal crisis within the Wales household. Another journalist claimed they'd received a message suggesting a royal child was struggling to cope with the role forced upon him. The palace's ironclad grip on its secrets was slipping. Meetings turned to interrogations. Trusted aides found themselves being questioned. Ed not just once but repeatedly. Loyalty, it seemed, had a price. One senior staff member who had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades was suddenly dismissed, escorted out without explanation. Sources suggest he had been in contact with a journalist just days before William's breakdown. Whether it was betrayal or coincidence no longer mattered. The palace could not afford doubt. Meanwhile, William, once the picture of calm leadership, was changing. He began using encrypted messaging apps to speak even with senior advisors. He kept his inner circle smaller than ever. Conversations that once took place in open corridors now happened behind closed doors. Phones were banned from certain rooms. Aides were rotated unexpectedly. William's paranoia wasn't personal, it was survival. Every message, every document, every glance had the potential to be weaponized. He wasn't just protecting George anymore. He was protecting the throne from exposure. And at the center of it all sat that letter. A simple piece of paper that had become a symbol of everything the palace feared: vulnerability, emotion, humanity, the one thing the monarchy had trained itself to conceal for generations. George's message, though never released publicly, became an invisible force inside the palace. Everyone knew of it. Few had seen it. But its power was undeniable. It reminded those within those walls that behind every polished title was a beating heart. And for some, that was far more dangerous than any political scandal. And just when they thought they'd regained control, one unexpected family member took the crisis into their own hands. She's the no-nonsense royal who's kept her emotions locked behind protocol, but even Princess Anne couldn't stay silent. Her confrontation with Prince William was as fierce as it was unexpected, and her allegiance was not where the palace had hoped. It happened quietly, behind the heavy doors of a royal retreat rarely used for meetings of this magnitude. Princess Anne, known for her stoicism and unflinching loyalty to the monarchy, had requested a private audience with her nephew. No advisors, no aides, just 2 members of the royal bloodline, one hardened by time, the other wounded by the weight of fatherhood. What was meant to be a supportive gesture quickly became something else entirely. Anne wasn't there to comfort William, she was there to confront him. According to a high-ranking insider, the moment she sat down, she locked eyes with him and said one sentence that cut through every layer of his pain: "Don't let the crown swallow your child." There was no preamble, no small talk, just the voice of a woman who had seen too many heirs lost to the shadows of duty. Anne had watched the palace react like a wounded animal, tightening control, silencing whispers and isolating truth. She had seen it before, and she refused to let history repeat itself. She reminded William, not gently, that she had made a conscious decision to raise her own children outside of the royal titles and pressures, that it hadn't been easy, that she had faced criticism, but that it had been necessary. And now, she asked him, was George truly choosing this life or simply surviving it? The debate escalated. William, still raw from the emotional storm of the previous days, reportedly tried to defend the institution. He argued that tradition mattered, that public duty came with sacrifice, and that the weight of legacy was not optional. But Anne wasn't swayed. Her voice remained calm, but her words grew sharper. She spoke of the cracks she'd witnessed behind palace walls, how titles had strained relationships, how expectations had bred resentment, how duty had devoured individuality. She warned him that George's message wasn't an isolated moment. It was a red flag, a final plea, and ignoring it could be the greatest mistake he'd ever make. Witnesses who saw William after the conversation say he was shaken, even more than after reading George's letter. He reportedly wept again, not just from sorrow, but from fear. Anne had voiced what he hadn't yet dared to say aloud, that if he followed the path laid out for him without question, he might lose his son long before the crown ever touched his head. And then, as she prepared to leave, Anne delivered one final blow. This is how dynasties die from the inside, when love becomes less important than legacy. The room fell silent. William didn't respond. He couldn't, but Anne wasn't the only one watching tea. The royal institution itself had begun to weigh its options, and George was now a wild card. What do you do when the heir to the heir threatens the very foundation of your legacy? Behind the smiles and pageantry, a brutal choice loomed: protect the image or protect the boy. As the days passed, the royal household found itself fractured from within. George's letter, though unseen by the public, had ignited a firestorm behind palace walls. Senior advisors, many of whom had served through decades of royal transitions, were split down the middle. Some, hardened by years of tradition, insisted the only way forward was to double down. The boy must be guided molded into what he was born to become. They spoke of discipline, structure, and corrective engagements that would restore George's public confidence. One advisor reportedly used the word course correct, as if the child's emotional plea was little more than a PR detour. Their vision was clear: minimize damage, uphold the image, and restore the narrative before the press caught wind of something too raw to contain. But others saw a different path, one that threatened to upend everything the monarchy had stood on for centuries. A growing minority within the palace began arguing that the institution itself had reached a tipping point, that perhaps the problem wasn't George but the expectations being forced upon him. They called for compassion, for a shift in tradition, for flexibility in how the next generation was brought up. It wasn't about rebellion, it was about survival. And they warned that forcing George back into the mold could break him permanently. The divide between these two camps grew sharper with each day of silence, and in the middle of this storm stood William and Catherine, unwavering but weary. The couple, already emotionally bruised, now faced impossible decisions. Advisors urged them to make a public statement to address the confusion before rumors spiraled further. But they refused. They would not sacrifice their son's vulnerability for the sake of palace optics. According to insiders, they blocked multiple attempts by royal communications teams to reframe the story, to subtly spin it into something more palatable for the public. William, once deferential to senior voices, now spoke with an edge not seen before. His position was clear: George's pain wouldn't become palace propaganda. And yet, the silence from King Charles was deafening. Not a word publicly, not a message privately. His stillness became its own statement, a quiet calculation from a monarch, weighing legacy against lineage. Those close to the king say he was deeply conflicted, torn between sympathy for his grandson and the cold reality of the institution he now led. But sympathy without action meant little, and so, in the void of leadership, the palace formed what insiders referred to as a crisis council, a meeting held behind closed doors, attended only by the most senior figures. Its purpose? To chart a path for George's future. A future being planned without him in the room. But something happened that none of them anticipated, something that couldn't be managed, scripted, or controlled. And then, just as the storm seemed to reach its peak, the world heard what no one expected, from the lips of Prince George himself. It was subtle, it was brief. But for those who understood, it was everything. In a carefully crafted moment, Prince George, still just a boy, spoke the words that would define the next era of the monarchy, and redefine what it means to be royal. No one expected it, not the press, not the palace, not even the advisors who had spent the last week desperately trying to shape a narrative. The moment arrived during a televised children's charity gala, a seemingly ordinary evening celebrating youth empowerment and resilience. A brief video montage began to roll, featuring messages from children across the country. Then, in a segment no one saw coming, Prince George appeared. The lighting was soft, the background neutral. But his voice, calm, steady, and hauntingly sincere, cut through the noise of the night. Sometimes, he said, even when you're born into something, you're still learning how to be you. There was a pause, a silence not edited out. And then the screen faded to black. It wasn't long, barely 15 seconds. But the impact was seismic. Within minutes, the clip flooded social media. Viewers around the world stopped in their tracks. Royal commentators, journalists, and everyday citizens alike began dissecting the words. Was it a scripted message? Was it approved by the palace? Or had George, even in his innocence, delivered a calculated blow to the centuries-old expectations that had defined his bloodline? Whatever the truth, the interpretation was clear. This was no ordinary soundbite. It was a message layered in meaning, a gentle resistance, a quiet confession, and a warning wrapped into one. #Let George be George began trending worldwide within the hour. Thousands shared stories of feeling trapped by family expectations, of wanting to forge their own paths. Parents spoke of protecting their children's individuality. Mental health advocates praised the honesty. And across it all, one question rose above the rest. Had the monarchy just allowed its next heir to speak from the heart? The midst of this frenzy, William Barr and Catherine were spotted in a rare moment of public intimacy, holding hands as they left a private dinner. It was more than affection. It was solidarity, a silent, unified stand behind their son. For a family trained to perform every gesture with precision, this display felt defiantly human. It said what they couldn't, that they stood with George, not just as royals but as parents who had chosen their child's truth over the institution's silence. The message from George did more than echo. It cracked open a centuries-old system just wide enough for light to pour in. Senior royal sources admitted off the record that the family was now reviewing how public responsibilities are introduced to younger members. The tone had changed, the conversation had shifted, and in a twist no one saw coming, what was once feared as a royal collapse began to feel like a royal rebirth. But transformation doesn't come without consequence, and for Prince William, the cost of choosing love over legacy is just beginning to unfold. He had everything to lose: his father's approval, the crown's favour, the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. But in that defining moment, Prince William made a choice. And that choice may just change the monarchy forever. After weeks of silence, pressure, and emotional upheaval, Prince William reached a conclusion that would split the royal household down the centre. He called for an immediate restructuring of George's duties, pulling him from upcoming public appearances, cancelling his exposure to ceremonial obligations, and quietly instructing advisors to remove his name from future event preparations. It was a decision made not from rebellion but protection, not from weakness but strength. It stunned those around him, not because it was bold but because it was unprecedented. No heir to the heir had ever been granted such space, such freedom. But William was no longer willing to let legacy come before life. Word of this decision reached King Charles swiftly. What followed was a private meeting, one that would become the subject of whispers throughout royal circles for weeks. Sources close to the palace describe it as tense, clipped, and ultimately cold. William laid out his position clearly. George would not be paraded to maintain an image. He would not be sacrificed for tradition. But Charles, ever the guardian of the crown's continuity, reportedly pushed back. The monarchy, he argued, survived on discipline, not emotion. And while he sympathized with George's pain, he reminded William of the consequences of appearing weak in the public eye. The exchange reportedly ended without a handshake, without understanding, without resolution. This moment became the monarchy's invisible fracture point. On one side, the Queen's legacy, rooted in unwavering public service, in appearances that never cracked, and roles that were never questioned. On the other, George's future uncertain, fragile, and painfully human. William found himself at a cross. Roads where bloodline met burden, where fatherhood collided with crown. And this time, he didn't flinch. He chose his son. The decision triggered panic inside the communications office. Leaks were feared. Public backlash anticipated. Advisors drafted talking points in case the press caught wind. But William shut it all down. No spin, he reportedly said. No cover story. Let silence speak. The risk was staggering. A single headline could paint George as a reluctant heir. A single opinion piece could suggest instability. But William no longer cared. He had stopped measuring success by public approval. His focus was now survival. The emotional survival of the boy he loved. One aide, speaking under anonymity, shared a final quote from William that stunned even the most loyal staffers. "He's my son before he's their symbol." 6 words that shattered generations of precedent. 6 words that reframed what monarchy could mean. It wasn't a rejection of tradition, it was a recalibration of it. And behind the scenes, the shift had already begun. Legal advisors quietly began drafting what sources are calling a modernized royal doctrine, an internal policy, reimagining the roles and expectations of royal children, with emphasis on mental health, personal autonomy, and delayed public duties. It hasn't been released, it may never be, but its existence is enough to confirm what many have begun to suspect. And so, as one prince sheds tears and another sheds expectations, the royal family star, NDS, on the edge of an era no crown has faced before. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.